Welcome to the second online lecture for our course. Hope that you're enjoying it so far, enjoying the readings. In this online time together, we'll kind of close out the discussion on the relationship between physician and patient, and then we'll begin introducing our first topic and the first kind of set of ethical issues that we'll address. So the first case study dealing with physician and patient, and all of these case studies kind of deal with the issue of boundaries in medicine. Pretty much with every profession that a person can be in, there will be proper boundaries that are established, and in medicine that's a critical area. So the first case study here, therapist has a self-employed landscape contractor for a client. The client is kind of in and out, the work is inconsistent, can't afford the therapy even though it's proving helpful. So they reach an agreement. The client will do landscaping for the therapist. Is this sort of bartered relationship ethical or not? Case study 2, a secretary working for a specialist medical practice faces a potentially serious illness within that practice's specialty. And let's add in maybe that this particular practice, let's add in a couple of things. Maybe one, they're the only practice with this specialty in the region, or maybe two, let's say they're considered the best in that region. Maybe they're in Kansas City and there's lots of offices that deal with this, but they're the best. Is it ethical for that secretary to receive care from one of the doctors for whom she works? And if so, if you say, with those ideas or with those parameters, yes, that it is okay for her to do so, what other protections ought they to put in place to govern this relationship? And you can certainly see all sorts of things that can arise out of this. What if the secretary's work suffers because of the medical treatment that she's going through? I mean, obviously, the Federal Medical Leave Act would protect some of those issues, but there's all sorts of things that can crop up with this. And then another question just to be thinking about, in just 60 years, there's been a lot more empowerment given to patients in terms of their ability to know things, their ability to direct their own treatment. But I think most would probably argue there's still room to grow. So what are things that can be done that can bring even greater empowerment to patients? And as we kind of wrap up those issues, we've spent a great deal of time arguing for stronger relationships between the physician and patient. That has eroded a great deal in modern medicine. A lot of people grew up with a kind of a dedicated primary care physician that they had a relationship with, that they saw regularly. That is becoming less and less. And some of that comes about because we have increased specialization in medicine, but I think it's also intentional on the medical community to keep any one medical professional from being assigned too much blame. If you're seeing 3 or 4 doctors all about the same issue, and then you end up having something arise that came about from malpractice or things didn't go the way they ought to have, who's responsible? When you have just one doctor, it's a lot easier to direct that responsibility. But when that care is dispersed amongst many, that can become an issue. On the other side, what protection can a patient and a physician both have in terms of their relationship becoming too close? So what protections do both need in that regard? So now we'll begin looking at the first issues. I hope that you've read the articles, the readings for this coming week that will help with looking at this. But you can also use this as an introduction just so long as you complete the readings before class on Tuesday. The first case study. So a husband and wife have pursued in vitro fertilization. They've gotten to the point where they have successfully created 3 dozen fertilized eggs. They're stored in a laboratory. They're ready for implantation. However, before the implantation begins, the relationship dissolves and they file for divorce, and both of them are seeking custody of all 3 dozen eggs in the divorce. And so now you're the judge, and how do you decide on this? And what are the various factors that might impact this decision? Another case study, while you were in college, you donated either egg or sperm to assist with finances. It was all done with the promise of anonymity. You never told your eventual spouse that you had done this. Of course, no one could have foreseen the arrival of things like Ancestry.com. And so it's 20 years later and you just got a knock on your door from someone saying that she or he is your child, and they might be needing financial support. They might just be looking for some sort of relationship with you. Let's say you at least go to the measure of doing the DNA testing, and it is determined this person is your biological child. So how do you respond to that? And how ought you to respond to that? And as a culture, should we put protections in place that if a person had done this in anonymity, that sort of information can't be found out? How should all of those sorts of things be handled? So all of these kind of arise out of the readings that we looked at. A lot of interesting things going on, a lot of interesting statistics, and we'll talk about them in class. But it's important to know the various types of assisted reproductive technologies that are out there. They're described and defined after the initial readings. So you'll want to be sure to read pages 372 to 379 and be familiar with the different ways that people are able to pursue having children when traditional childbearing processes may fail them. And then what are the ethical issues that assistive reproductive technologies create? And what are the various biomedical ethic forces that conflict with each other on these matters? And what this really brings up is what constitutes a family. The very first kind of case that we looked at brings that up. And then certainly also what would be methods of reproductive technology that you would support, what might be some that you would not support. Then from the Louise Brown case, the very first child successfully conceived and taken all the way to birth and obviously life beyond. That whole case and everything that has come after it does give rise to a lot of different questions. And the very first one is, when does life begin? Now that's a critical issue that we'll be looking at and thinking about in this class together. We looked on Tuesday at the modern Hippocratic Oath, which specifically prohibits playing God. How can technology of this sort, and this applies to a lot of things, but how can that not be seen as playing God? And a big question also arises from what happens or should happen to unused fertilized eggs. The case study we looked at earlier involving the couple that wants a divorce and they both want custody, that's sort of an issue that arises. But depending on how you define the beginning of life, there's going to be different answers to this question as well. The article the pages on egg and sperm donation bring up a lot of things. They talk about, for ladies who do egg donations, very serious medical issues arise in 0.7% of the donors. And in 8.5% of the donors, fairly serious medical issues arise. Is this an acceptable risk? And so clearly, science is saying that it is. Now, at what point would they say it wouldn't be acceptable? If instead of 0.7%, if it was 7% that developed very serious medical issues, and instead of 8.5%, it was 15 or 20 or 25% that developed a medical issue that required treatment. There are arbitrary forces at work there. So what makes it acceptable at 0.7% and 8.5% and maybe not acceptable at higher levels? It also brings up the issue, in the reading, they talk about there are concerns and there are individuals who have donated eggs later in life who were infertile, developed uterine cancer, a lot of testimony toward that end, but there have been no studies that have been done on egg donors in regard to later infertility in life, if they run a risk of higher rates of infertility, or if they run a risk of higher rates of uterine cancer. Now, the medical field studies everything. So why wouldn't science want to study this? And then also, donor clinics have recommendations that guide their use of donated eggs and sperm. But, in regard to how many times a woman is supposed to be able to donate eggs, and then how many people that let's say a sperm donor's donations can be used. But those are just recommendations. Those are just guidelines, and there isn't anything preventing. The article pointed out that there's a very famous case in Washington, D.C. alone, that one sperm donor had provided the genetic material for 150 children living in that area. And there's no tracking of any of that done. The government doesn't require tracking of where eggs and sperm go, in a sense. And unfortunately, there have been cases of two people meeting, falling in love, getting married, wanting to have children, and then discovering that, even after conceiving, they discover their child has serious deformities. And when the doctor does the test, discovers that they are genetically brother and sister from circumstances like this. So what ought we to put in place to prevent such a thing from happening? Then with the whole issue of cloning, the article points out, after it was announced that Dolly had been cloned, that it had happened with sheep, the president at that time, President Clinton, issued an executive order banning research that could lead to human cloning. Now, it's not too difficult to see what the problem with that is. Any research into cloning is research that could lead to human cloning. And so we'll talk about the issues of technology as this goes along, but how can you pursue things in one area? We've all benefited, we've all consumed grain and vegetables and things that have been genetically manipulated. But the same research that made that possible is the research that can lead to human cloning. So how do we put protections in place? And then from the issues with surrogacy, a couple of different contrasting issues. In the Baby M case, the father provided the sperm, the wife could not conceive, And so the husband's sperm was combined with the egg from their surrogate. They had a contract in place to say that after birth, the child would go to the married couple. But as things got closer, both the birth mother and the genetic biological mother wanted to keep the child. The court's ruling on that went back and forth. The Calvert case was very different. In that particular case, both the sperm and the egg came from the husband and wife. The surrogate simply was the physical vehicle for the child. And then after birth, she wanted to keep it. The courts there ruled very differently. One of the big issues, though, is these court cases take so long to adjudicate. So who ought to care for the child while the courts are deciding? With whom should the child live during those critical formative years of infancy when incredible bonding takes place or ought to take place? When the courts are making decisions on this, who ought to care for the child? What effect is there on the child that arises out of things of this sort? As you read the article on the Save Your Sibling, what was your initial reaction to this couple's plan? They were having a child solely for the purpose and the hope that she might be a donor match to their daughter who had contracted leukemia. And you can imagine all sorts of other potential ethical issues that could have sprung from this. So let's say that in utero, the third child that they're having, the one that they hope is able to be a donor match, is determined that in utero, the fetus, the baby, is not a genetic match. And they choose to abort that baby and then want to get pregnant again very quickly in the hopes that the 1 in 4 chance comes true. Now you can see that all sorts of things arise out of these sorts of circumstances. So as we look at this and we think about the various forces, you can see how almost all of the forces that we discussed in session 1 are at work here. You have autonomy and what a person can decide what to do with their own bodies, but there is that contrast between what's best for the individual and what's best for society. Non-malfeasance, the thing about saying, first do no harm. With egg donation, we know that in 8.5% of the cases, there's going to be some form of harm. But is that outweighed by the benevolence of the good that is brought about through that? You'll have those that will argue, obviously, for the inviolability of life, that we shouldn't be messing with these things whatsoever. We shouldn't be drilling down as far as DNA and being able to manipulate that. Versus, the offer of a cure, the ability to stop genetic predispositions toward terrible diseases. We have the issue of social justice versus sustainability. Think about how much money every year is spent on things like in vitro fertilization and basically all the various reproductive technologies. Would it be better use for society as a whole to dedicate those resources in other ways? These are the types of questions that we have to deal with in this. Some closing thoughts. As I mentioned earlier, 21st century medicine is becoming more impersonal. They want us to have our care separated out amongst many people. How can we return more of a personal touch to medicine without that going too far and crossing boundaries that it ought not. And again, what are some protections that ought to exist for both patients and medical professionals? And then running the key thing that runs through so many of the articles and the readings for this coming week, technology holds such incredible promise, both for good and for evil. So how can we maximize the good and minimize or eliminate the potential for evil? That's one of the critical issues that's facing us as a culture. Just remember to participate in the forum this week, and you should have everything now to begin working on the second paper. It's not due for another week, but you should have everything you need so you can begin working on that as you wish. Thank you very much.